So, today we're going to talk about evolution, and evolution is a change in the frequency of an allele in a population. Now, remember that an allele is a version of a gene, so it's the change in the frequency of a version of a gene in a population being present. This theory was originally developed by a scientist named Charles Darwin. And he developed the idea of natural selection and evolution as well. But natural selection is what I really want to focus on a lot today. Now, to make natural selection a little bit easier to understand, I first want to talk about artificial selection. And artificial selection is when humans breed organisms for certain traits, and these may or may not benefit their survival, but it changes their alleles, it changes their appearance and their abilities. An example of this actually comes with the Manx cat. Now, Manx is a genetic trait, having no tail, and it affects the spinal column. Manx is a dominant trait. Now, if an organism is homozygous for Manx, which like I said is a spinal mutation, they're not going to survive. Normal is recessive, and an organism which is homozygous recessive will have a full-length tail. Now, a cat that is heterozygous, remember that means it has one dominant and one recessive allele, or one dominant and one recessive version, will be a Manx and has a good chance of being fairly healthy. So this is one of those situations where in the wild, the Manx gene will be very uncommon, because if you have Manxes becoming common and you have Manxes breeding with each other, you then have a 25% chance of having a dead cat from every breeding pair of Manxes. So this would not be a very successful genotype to have in the wild. However, humans love Manx cats, and so there are some that are specifically bred to try to create more Manxes, although some consider this inhumane because of the high risk for the embryonic kittens. Now, natural selection, which is a theory that was developed by Darwin, suggests that environmental factors increase the success rate or the failure rate of a genotype to reproduce. This is the idea of survival of the fittest. Now, when I say fittest, don't picture the most muscular lion or the most ripped zebra. What I mean by this is fitness is purely the ability of an organism to pass on its genes to future generations. So the more offspring you have, the more fit you are, because you've been more successful at passing on your genes. Now, in order to pass on your genes, you must first survive, hence the idea of survival of the fittest. The organisms whose traits are most fit for the environment and allow them to survive and reproduce the most will be the ones whose genes are passed on to future generations. And there are a few examples or mechanisms that animals can use to stay alive. One of these is camouflage. Camouflage may make an animal match its surrounding, making it more difficult for predators to see or for prey to see a predator coming. Or camouflage may also make it more difficult to pick an individual animal out from a group, such as with zebras. When you have an entire herd of striped zebras, those stripes break up the lines of where one zebra begins and another one ends. It makes it difficult to say, ooh, that is the zebra I want to eat. It makes it hard to pick them out individually. Social behavior is another type of survival technique. Some individuals in a group may serve as lookouts while the rest of the group feeds. And with organisms like giraffes, this is especially important because when a giraffe bends down to drink, they're very, very vulnerable. So if the other giraffes around them serve as lookouts and they take turns drinking, all the giraffes are able to live longer by having that social interaction with each other. Another type of social behavior is hunting cooperatively, as lions do. This allows them to have more successful hunts. Even though they're forced to share the food with other lions, they get to eat more frequently, so overall it comes out better for them. Another response to an attempt to be fit and survive is the response to fear as fight or flight. And in this example, we have a macaw, and birds that do not fly away from danger are more likely to be eaten than those who take to the air. And what I mean by this is that an organism's choice and its behavior, whether it will fight a threat or try to escape from a threat, is also genetic. Behaviors may also be genetic, such as the social behaviors. So, organisms and how they respond to fear can determine, do they survive to reproduce or do they get eaten? Interspecies relationships is another social behavior that can be affected by evolution. Animals of different species are often found feeding together, especially in Africa, and this is because these different species have the ability to pay attention to predators in different ways. For example, the giraffes obviously are able to see more easily in a longer distance because of their height advantage. You have other organisms, such as some of the antelope, that when they jump, they give a very good visual signal to the animals around them that there is a threat. So think of a white-tailed deer running away with that tail lifted up and the white exposed. That's a visual signal to other deer to run. And if there were other grazing animals with the deer and they saw that display of a flight and it's a signal, they can benefit from that as well, not just the deer. Another modification that helps organisms survive may be changes because of climate. So it's not just being eaten that can decrease survival. Animals may also freeze to death if they are not able to keep warm enough, or they may overheat. So in this example, African elephants have larger ears than Indian elephants because it's hotter in Africa. And these larger ears make it easier for African elephants to stay cool. Another example of how how there can be modifications for climate is the giant weta, which is basically an exceptionally large cricket found in New Zealand. And in New Zealand, it can get quite cold, and the larger size of the weta actually allows it to stay warmer longer, and then the weta has an additional ability to actually freeze solid and then thaw and still survive. But what I want to focus on here is the larger body means that there is less surface area exposed to the outer environment for the volume of the organism. So you'll usually find larger versions of an organism in cooler climates and smaller versions in warmer climates. This is true of many animals. Another one that comes to mind for me is the duck-billed platypus of Australia. In Australia, the further north you go, the smaller the platypuses are. And the more southerly direction you head, such as down around Tasmania, have the largest of the duck-billed platypuses because it is coldest there. And so having a larger body size actually helps insulate them because less of their surface area or less of the volume of the organism is exposed to the environment. Now, in order for a trait to be selected upon, it must be available. So, heredity and natural selection go hand in hand. The traits that are chosen by natural selection are present and must be inheritable. So, say a deer gets run over by a truck and loses a leg and is rehabilitated and released back into the wild and manages to have offspring. Having 3 legs will not be passed on to future generations. That's not genetic. However, traits like albinism are. So if you'll see, we have an albino deer on the right and a normal colored deer on the left. Now, typically, according to natural selection, the gene for being an albino will be selected against because the chances of an albino deer living as long as a normally colored deer are slim. If you just glance at this image, which deer do you notice first? The white one really stands out. So if you were a predator and there's a herd of deer, the one you're most likely to go after is the albino simply because it's easier to see. So the chance of this albino surviving to adulthood and maturing, finding a mate who will accept them because they're visually different, and we'll get to that in a moment, and then reproducing are fairly slim because it's like they have a big bullseye painted on them by standing out from the rest of their kind and by not being camouflaged as well as others. So, in order for genes that are successful, or in order for traits to be successful to be passed on, they must be genetic. And so heredity plays a very large role in natural selection and evolution. Now, sometimes the little changes that occur actually come from something called a mutation. Over time, these little changes or little selections through evolution can change an organism very substantially. And here we have the evolution of the horse. Horses originally had 5 toes that were more like paws, and now they're down to just one toe, which is encased in a hard hoof, or a very large fingernail, basically. Now, it may have been that very small changes occurred, and that if you go to Eohippus down here between Eohippus and Mesohippus, it may have just been a small change over periods of time where maybe one horse had a slightly shorter toe, Eohippus had a slightly smaller fifth toe than another, and that one was actually able to run faster and was more successful. And over time, that trait gained in dominance. And so you had more and more horses that had that shortened fifth toe. And eventually it worked out so you move up to Merychippus and you're down to 3 toes because the organisms that had the shorter toes did better and better and better. And so eventually worked our way up to where we had the one-toed horse that is very large. You can see Philohippus here has only one toe as well as the modern horse, but the modern horse is larger. So perhaps the larger Philohippuses survived better and eventually evolved into the modern horse, which is one-toed and fairly large. Now, another possibility to happen, if we go back to Eohippus, is there was a mutation or change in the genes in this organism. It was a random fluke event, and the offspring that carried this fluke event in the gene was more successful than the normal ones. And so its genes were passed on. So, just very briefly, let me let you watch this video about mutations to help clear up any questions you might have or to help explain this a little bit more clearly, because remember and think back to transcription and translation. Your genetics are controlled by your DNA, and you have those base pairs. Remember, a codon is made of 3 base pairs. So, if the codon is changed, it changes the amino acid, which changes the protein, and the protein is to determine how we are. So keep that in mind as you watch this video on mutations.
Change in the nucleotide sequence of a gene. This can result from an error during replication that is not corrected by the usual repair mechanisms. Under normal circumstances, adenines and thymines should bind to one another, as should cytosines and guanines. In a base substitution mutation, a non-complementary nucleotide is incorporated into the new strand. The resulting altered triplet may code for a different amino acid, or even a stop codon. Here we see 4 codons and their corresponding amino acids. A change within the second triplet results in a change in the amino acid. None of the other amino acids are affected. Insertions and deletions result in frame shift mutations. The insertion of an extra nucleotide not only affects the triplet it is part of, but all subsequent triplets, thus drastically altering the protein product. The result is similar if a nucleotide is deleted.
Now, we're going to move on. So, just understand that mutations are changes in the genes, and that these result in a change in the organism because it changes the proteins that are produced. Usually, these mutations are problematic for an organism, but every now and then it gives them a slight edge, and that slight edge may allow them to be more successful and have more offspring, which passes that mutation on to the next generation. And as long as the mutation continues to be favored by natural selection, it can continue to spread. Now, sometimes you'll see traits like these brightly colored birds and you're thinking, okay, explain this to me. How on earth can natural selection select for these crazy bright colored birds? Obviously, they're a lot easier to pick out and eat. And you're right, there is another force at work here. Sexual selection is selection of traits based on the ability to have more opportunities or success in reproduction, not survival. Some of these traits actually make it more difficult for the organism to survive. So if you look at the birds in this picture, they're brightly colored, they have very long tail feathers, and this would make them a much easier target for a predator. However, there's a catch. The females find this attractive, and we'll get into the whys on that in just a minute. Because the females find some of these traits attractive, you're going to have what's called sexual dimorphism. Sexual dimorphism is a difference in the appearance between males and females of the same species, and this is usually a result of sexual selection. Now, sexual selection comes in a couple of different varieties. And one of those is male-male competition. And in this case, it may not be that the female favors the appearance, but it may be the males physically compete with each other, or may vocally compete with each other, to try to win the rights to breed with the female. In this case, these large antlers can serve a dual purpose. And these are elk, by the way. The elk can use these antlers to fight off a predator, and they do use them that way. However, the antlers are also used in competitions between the males because male elk keep herds of females called a harem, and the dominant male has exclusive rights to the harem. So other males will come and fight him in an effort to gain rights to breed with these females. So the antlers develop as a form of male-male competition from sexual selection. These actually take a lot of energy to produce. They're heavy. And this whole harem process for the male of guarding these females, he can actually just lose a very large percentage of his body weight guarding the females from other males. It's a very strenuous process. But here's the thing. The females are able to evaluate that these males are actually worth breeding with, and they will stay in the harem and breed with the winning male because only the most healthy males with the best genes are going to be able to defend a harem. So the females, by relying on the male's competition to determine who they breed with, are getting the healthiest, strongest male in that area because the competition weeds out weaker males who would be defeated by males who have better genes for that area. So male-male competition serves survival by forcing a situation where only the most successful males are able to breed with females, giving them the best genes to pass on to their offspring. Another type of sexual selection is female choice. Now, female choice requires that the males impress the females, and in this case, instead of the males keeping a harem, the females are choosing which males they want to mate with. And when this occurs, the males will sometimes go to rather extreme lengths to attract a female. And this is not without its risk. Now, let you watch this video on the bowerbirds, and then we'll discuss some of this information in just a minute.
The Vogelkop bowerbird. He might lack the plumage, but he's got an extraordinary repertoire of song. And he's a wonderful mimic. Those are pigeon wing beats. That's a modest tiger parrot. And that, a sulphur-crested cockatoo. Even more surprising, he's an avid collector, with a very appreciative eye for colour. This male favours red and orange flowers. And he's very fond of fungus. Not everything he collects stays where it should. He puts these treasures on display within and around a construction that has taken him years to build. A giant bower woven around a central sapling, carpeted with moss. This grand design is no nest. It's the ultimate seduction parlour. But he's not alone on this hillside. He's got 6 rivals within earshot. This one prefers darker colours, decorating his bower with deer dung. And charcoal. Visual effect is of crucial importance. Clearly, he hadn't planned on all this sprouting fungus. He and his nearest rival live a stone's throw apart. Competition is intense. It's the dung ball bower that is the first to catch the female's attention. He withdraws while she inspects his workmanship. She's back again and seems impressed. But on closer inspection, she's less convinced. Perhaps it was that sprouting fungus. Back at the flower bower, the male performs a dress rehearsal. He senses she's watching. This is the moment he's been working towards. His bower channels his song in her direction. A final check. All is to her liking. Few birds devote such craft, effort, and ingenuity to achieve this life-defining moment.
So, here is an example of where the sexual dimorphism is not in appearance. However, there's a very large difference in the behavior between the male and female bowerbirds. The female will actually go off now and build a nest completely on her own, and the male will not aid at all in the raising of the young. He has provided simply what she hopes is going to be good quality sperm. She selected the male based upon the conditions of his bower, and those take a great deal of energy to produce. So she is assuming, if birds can assume, that a male who can produce such a beautiful, well decorated bower must have lots of energy and be very fit, and will make a good genetic father for her offspring. Now, of course, there has to be a balance between natural selection and sexual selection. If the male bower birds put all of their energy literally into building these bowers, they wouldn't survive long enough to breed. If a peacock here, which have these beautiful long tail feathers, and only the males have this, the peahens are much drabber in color. If their tails reach a point where they're too long, it makes them easy prey for tigers. These are native to India. And it makes them easier prey for tigers. So there has to be a balance somewhere in there between the sexiness. It is limited by survival. So if a male's song that he sings for a female bird goes on for so long that he attracts a predator, then he's going to be eaten. And a male whose song is a little bit shorter and doesn't give the predator quite enough time to zero in before he flies is more likely to survive. And so that slightly shorter song length will be passed on to his offspring and their offspring. And in this way, things that involve sexual selection that appear to be just not advantageous for survival and often quite dangerous can be passed on to future generations if if they prove to the female that the male is very fit, or if they're a way for a male to defend his right to breed with the female from other males. These will be passed on if they are successful. So when you're looking at traits of organisms, I want you to start thinking, are these traits the result of sexual selection, natural selection, and where might these be limited if they are sexual selection by the pressures of natural selection?